we're going to get into the part you're all here for, which is to hear from our keynote speaker, Josh Koenig. Josh is here from San Francisco. He is, for those of you who don't know Josh, he is the head of product and one of the co-founders of Pantheon. Pantheon is, well, they're one of our sponsors, and they're also a massive web management platform. They do a lot of stuff with WordPress and Drupal, and we're really grateful to have them here. Josh has been contributing to open source for a very long time. He's been blogging since the early days of when it was new, you know, back with the OGs of blogging. And I just wanted to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a bunch, Ryan. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you all for giving me your attention. It is definitely an honor to be here in beautiful Salt Lake City with its picturesque mountains and its wide avenues. When I was talking to Ryan about what to do with the keynote, he said, well, you know, it's LoopConf, so there's going to be a ton of really technical content. A lot of the how of WordPress will be presented all weekend long, or all week long, and maybe you could start with the why. And so I kind of took that as a challenge and ran with it and really used this presentation as an opportunity to clarify a bunch of my own thinking about, you know, why it is we're all here and what it is we're all doing, and kind of what are some of the challenges that we face in the wider ecosystem of the web and within the WordPress project in particular. So I'm going to hopefully present those thoughts and maybe spark some thoughts of your own, and we'll chat more about it later. So just real quick, hi, my name's Josh. I'm Outlandish Josh on the internet, as Ryan mentioned, I'm here because I started blogging, if I trace it back, like 15 years ago, with a website that I made myself by hand. I created my own CMS, and then I started using something called Cafe Press, B2 Cafe. Some of you may be aware of that, was just kind of out there on the internet doing my thing. But then something interesting happened to me a couple years later. I got really involved in politics and worked as a volunteer on this campaign for this dude named Howard Dean, which was kind of famous and then exploded. And I followed through on that to work with a nationwide nonprofit called Music for America, which actually, the first time I ever came to Salt Lake City, it was to register voters at like an independent metal concert down in some warehouse over there. It was super cool. And through that, I got involved in the Drupal project, really kind of at the point in that graph where Drupal just started to go up, and kind of rode that for a good 5-6 years, which was pretty exciting. Became a professional. 2006, some friends of mine and I started a consultancy, Chapter 3, Your Drupal Experts in San Francisco, and we built that up. And in 2010, we launched, or founded Pantheon. It took us a couple of years to actually get it launched because we had to build a bunch of stuff. But basically, Pantheon was, hey, we learned all this stuff building Drupal websites for all kinds of clients, and we seem to be doing this infrastructure piece over and over and over again. That could be just a service. We could turn that into a thing that we give to everybody, and that was the idea. And it's worked out fairly well since then. We're serving billions of page views a month, lots of WordPress sites, lots of Drupal sites, lots of great projects, and lots of wonderful developers using the platform. You bring the lightning, we bring the thunder. And then in 2014, we opened that up. Originally, Pantheon was a Drupal-centric platform, and then we opened it up to WordPress because duh. And I started going to events, and this picture is actually from WordCamp Miami from 2.5 years ago. And it was, you know, it's been really a pleasure to dive back into this community and get to know it as a technology and so forth. It's really, I love the WordPress community. It's a lot of fun. So hello again, and welcome. So, developers who love WordPress, why are we here? What has brought us together into this room today, and what brings us together for those of you who are joining online? Well, I think we're here for a number of reasons. The first is that freedom matters, and I don't know that how many of us in the room are like Richard Stallman stalwarts, and because that's in a pretty extreme position to take, but I think we all believe that human beings should be in control of the technology that in many ways organizes and shapes their lives. That's a very important thing that I think everyone in here understands at a gut level. I also think it's because the power of publishing is undeniably real. It's not always positive, but you can't deny the fact that the way in which the internet allows us to share information with one another is radically reshaping the world in ways that are going to continue happening, and it is very exciting and meaningful to be in the midst of that. I think that's something that draws us together into WordPress as a community. And I think finally we're here, especially at something like LoopConf, because our careers are freaking awesome, and we want to keep things going and growing and develop new tools and techniques and serve the world in better ways. And that's a great reason to come together. And WordPress is doing great, right? So we're at, according to the W3 Techs, 27% of websites run on WordPress, and it keeps going up. Market share is increasing, adoption is increasing, and the month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year, those numbers are going up and to the right, which is what everybody wants to have happen. So, given that, what's with the angst? And maybe angst is a strong word, but as I travel through the community of WordPress and talk to people, there are like kind of undercurrents of nervousness, maybe some concerns, there's confusion, there's worries about the future. And I think it's because as a project, this project has come such a long way and has reached such an impressive scale and size, but there's still a ways to go. And so that, and there's a lot of challenges ahead. And I think that being able to talk openly about those challenges is really important to understand how we meet them, how we overcome them, and how we succeed together. I think the meta challenge is that we're living through this inevitable transition that happens to all open source projects that reach scale and become sustainable as a going concern, which is they transform from a hobby into an industry. And you can see this play out with lots of projects, but obviously the most famous one would be the Linux project. So 10 years from some Finnish grad student publishing a monolithic microkernel on an obscure mailing list, 10 years later, you've got IBM painting giant penguins on the side of buildings in New York. And this isn't to say that it's about marketing. That's actually kind of just a side effect, a very visible side effect. It's a nice visual of what that means. It has to do with an industry is a world where lots and lots of different entities form an economic ecosystem around a project. And that is what is happening to WordPress now, but I think that the point is we're not done. We're sort of in the middle of this at the moment. And there are aspects of WordPress that are still very much operate on kind of a hobby basis, and there's aspects of that we want to preserve, that must be preserved in order to keep the essential character of WordPress the same. And then there are other aspects of it that are operating more and more like an industry. And some of those are great, but some of them might not be so great, and that creates a little bit of consternation. And I think that one of the interesting things to me is talking to people I know in the community who have been around much longer than I have and are more well connected. There's lots of different opinions about how we're making our way through this. And I think that's another source of the angst, which is that there is a sort of a diversity of opinions about how we're going to make it through this transition. Everybody knows that it's going on, but we don't really know how it's supposed to play out. And so that kind of uncertainty creates feelings of dissonance. So the question is, in the face of all this, what is a developerpreneur to do? That's kind of all of us in the room, I think. Most of us would qualify as developerpreneurs. Well, so I think, again, the first step towards solving a problem, to use a cliche, is admitting there's a problem to be solved. And it's not to say that there's actually a single problem, because I'll kind of single out 4 different things I think are generally thematically creating consternation. But just being able to understand where the challenges are and where the friction is a really big first step towards being able to move forward with more confidence and solve them. So if you'll permit me, I'm going to diagnose the challenges that WordPress faces. All right. Number 1. Publishing as a market on the internet, and particularly as a SaaS market, is an incredibly competitive market. It's a very valuable market, it's a lucrative market, that's why it's so competitive, but it is a brawl out there in terms of the different technologies that exist. I mean, I don't know how many of you watched the Super Bowl, but 2 of these companies had pretty big, expensive ad spots on during the Super Bowl. Many of the others have a lot of energy and momentum behind them, and WordPress.com is competing with all of these different players to try to position WordPress as a tool that everybody around the world could use to build their own website and publish their own words. The WordPress ad was not on during the Super Bowl. They made one, though. It was online only. You should check it out. I was pretty impressed, actually. It's very professional, pretty high level. And they're clearly, Automatic is getting more and more serious about marketing. They've talked publicly about that. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But there wasn't one aired because that's not quite there yet. Maybe next year. We'll see. But you might ask, why am I just listing a bunch of different services? Like, what about .org? And I think this is a really important point to get across to the audience of developers. There's a kind of a mental fallacy that we often fall victim to, and I'm guilty of this as well, which is you look at something like WordPress.org, and WordPress is an open source project, and you're like, that's so easy, it's free, right? I just download the tarball, I upload it to my web server, I configure my database credentials, I run the installer, and in 5 minutes, I've got a working website. That is so awesome. The world is free. And the truth is, freedom isn't free. Free is in freedom, which is freedom isn't free. Not free as in beer, which is fun when you have a sponsor. Freedom isn't free, and the reason is that the secret cost of open source is that you age while you figure out how to use it. It takes time, and it takes expertise. And the reality of the situation is it is not reasonable to expect most human beings on planet Earth to figure out what a tarball is, how to create an account with a web host, and where their database credentials live. People will want to be able to just use a service that is configured for them and maintained for them. Not everyone, but if you think about the broad public, they need something like that. It is mandatory that it is delivered as a service. So I like to explain this with like a little analogy from Game of Thrones. Who among us is a Game of Thrones fan? So most in the room. I'll just explain this really quickly. So Game of Thrones, fantasy series, knights, sorcery, dragons. These are the Greyjoys, and they're a people who have a kingdom on an island, and their culture is really based around like this macho raiding culture, where like they're like, we don't grow crops, we just go rob it from other people. Literally, that's their style. And they have in their culture this notion of the gold price and the iron price. The gold price means you paid money for something, you traded for it, and it's kind of like, oh, you paid the gold price for that? Whereas the iron price means you took this by the sword. I paid the iron price for this ship, or I paid the iron price for this food or something. And it means you went and like took it from someone. And that's a bit like the bargain that we make to the world with open source, where open source demands the iron price. You must do it in order to use it. And for many out there in the world, they're just radically unprepared to pay any kind of iron price whatsoever because they don't have the sword, right? They'd have to hire a mercenary like one of us to go do it for them. And they would much prefer to pay the gold price or the plastic price with their credit card. And so I imagine how this conversation goes down, like Theon Greyjoy kind of out of his depth, his sister a little bit more of a baller, and she's kind of like, are you really prepared to maintain and to protect that lamp stack indefinitely, Theon? And Theon's like, yes, but no. You know the Theon server got owned. And meanwhile, I mean, it's really hard because old man Greyjoy knows this, and he's like, oh, my son's kind of a screw up. And he's just thinking to himself, maybe this will finally be the year of Linux on the desktop. And it will not, because the iron price cannot be paid by enough people. So things move fast in this world, and I think the fact that a lot of us are, for us the iron price is cheap. We pay it every day. It's what we do. We get up in the morning, we figure out how computers work. And the fact that what's necessary to meet the demands of a broad market for online publishing is something much more than that is hard for us. I think it creates confusion. And it creates, in the WordPress world, inevitably there's some friction when what's best for WordPress.com might not be what's in the best for everyone else. And kind of figuring out how to understand the distinctions and trade-offs around that creates angst and confusion. So that's one of the problems that we face, in addition to the competition. Another problem is looking at how WordPress can move upmarket into enterprise-type projects, which I imagine many people in the room have experience working on. So I was at Post Status Publish before WordCamp US in Philly, and there was a really, really interesting conversation between Brian, who organized the conference, and Christina Warren, who's a technology journalist, worked at Mashable for many years, covered WordPress in the early days, and has like a really deep understanding of the industry. And she was talking about how she sees many big websites, and in particular even online publishers, considering and then rejecting WordPress as a solution. And the reason is that they don't feel that they have the capabilities in-house or can bring the capabilities on in a reasonable way in terms of hiring people to extend WordPress to meet their needs. And they'd rather, in the way that Vox with their Chorus and BuzzFeed for their internal project, like they're two very high-profile examples that have been loud and proud about this. Like, we build the whole enchilada. And the reason is, for these companies, there's a little bit of, I think, hubris that their technology is going to have strategic value for them, which I don't agree with. I think in 2 more years, they're going to look at like declining budgets and be like, holy crap, we have all this technical debt that we own exclusively. But they make a rational trade-off at the initial point saying, look, I've got an engineering team, they know Rails, we can build this in Rails and we'll own it and we'll be able to take control of it versus, yeah, like WordPress is 85% of what we want, but what about that last 15%? Can we really do that? Do we know enough about how to do that? And so they look at those two things and they said, let's roll our own. This is still happening a lot. I mean, and let's be fair, this is not, there's no shame in this. Like, again, I started out rolling my own CMS, and who among us also has had that experience? Right, so it's okay. Like, this is maybe where a lot of people get started, but it's happening in organizations that are like, really like they're throwing big money into this and kind of, not into things that could maybe be reused and repurposed and help the wider world. So that's a challenge that we face. I also think that if you take a step back from media and you think about like just how big companies think about buying websites. Like, this is a slide from Gartner, which is a technology analysis company, and they publish this thing called the Magic Quadrant every year, and it kind of divides the players in different industries up into these different areas, and you want to be in the top right because that's where the leaders are, and their word for website technology is WCM. Web Content Management. And the leaders, in Gartner's eyes, in web content management are Adobe, makers of Photoshop, but also Adobe Experience Manager, Sitecore, which is the #1 web platform in the Microsoft ecosystem, Acquia, who are the big company to emerge out of the Drupal ecosystem, and then IBM and Oracle are also up in there like you'd expect giant companies would be. Automatic is on the quadrant, but they're in the visionaries area, which is because they don't have to get to the leader area, they would have to improve on their ability to execute, right? And that speaks to the same perception being filtering around the world of just how large companies, Fortune 500 companies, publicly traded companies think about buying website technology. That perception is out there, and I think we could quibble with whether that perception is accurate, but it's going to take time to change those perceptions, because the people at Gartner, I don't think there's any of them in the room here now, and then they need to get clued in. They also have a whole ecosystem that drives this. So if you think about Adobe, right? Adobe has Adobe Experience Manager, which they're going out and selling to C-level executives all over the place. And they work with these big creative design agencies, like Huge is a wonderful design agency. They do some really awesome work. And they work really closely with Adobe, because what Huge cares about is making their clients successful. At the end of the day, that is their whole deal. And they trust Adobe because they have a good working relationship and they've spent some time together. And then when it comes time, when the rubber meets the road and the client is like, the project's behind and the deadline is looming, we've all been there, right? When they're able to bring in one of these large consulting firms like Accenture, and they can be like, hey, we need like 25 more people on this tomorrow. Can you do that? And they're like, oh, of course. You can write us a 7-figure check, right? And they're like, oh yeah, no problem. And the point here is that there's an attraction, there's avoidance of risk is really big in the enterprise market. And so because WordPress does not yet have a broad enough base of talent and a well enough established track record and enough of these kind of big players who can back it with full force. Like, I actually can tell you for a fact, Accenture has a WordPress team, but it's much smaller than like their Java team. It's smaller than their Adobe team. It's smaller than their Sitecore team because it's still developing. And so this ecosystem exists in the enterprise, and it's really like the budgets are huge, but it's organized around mitigating risk and preventing people from failing. And so we can go in there and say, hey, we could do it like more efficiently, less expensively. But if we can't make the same promises around risk, it's just never going to fly. So that leads to some issues that I think come up in the world around just turning pro and the cultural aspect of the hobby to industry transition. I think WordPress has a really wonderful community. I'll say it again and again and again, and it's because you have so many people from unconventional backgrounds who bring their whole personality to the equation, who are quirky and idiosyncratic and not afraid to be complete and total human beings with one another as we do this work together. I think that's a big part of what makes the internet great, and I think WordPress as a project is an exemplar of that. But there's a big difference between that type of culture and that type of community and your typical if you work at Vince Vaughn's clip art company, it's tough. And so these are gut level concerns that come up. Like, what if, all these aggressive tech bros start showing up at our events? Or, what if people start looking at me sideways because I'm wearing a hoodie? Or what if people, these are the types of concerns that people have. Will people be excluded? Will people be welcomed? And so on and so forth. I think there's also this big challenge in the community with imposter syndrome, which is something that's very common in areas where people have taught themselves. There's a lot of autodidacts in the WordPress community, people who learned by doing, who just got into it. They were the ones who figured out at the beginning how to get the tarball and the web server and the database and could get through the 5-minute install, and then 5 years later they're a WordPress consultant or expert. And there's this worry that I'm not really an expert. I wasn't formally trained in this. And so I'll spill the beans on myself. I have a Bachelor of the Fine Arts, but it so happens that my BFA is in theater, so I spent 4 years training how not to have imposter syndrome. So I have a leg up in this race. And in addition to the fact that I have all the other stuff going for me, I'm tall, I'm a guy, but I think this is a real challenge for the community to overcome this sense that we're not truly experts, because we are. And lastly, I think there is this real worry for people who have a niche, who have something that they like. They have a lifestyle or a business or a market that they don't want to grow. They don't want to scale. They don't want to take on the world. They just want to keep what they've got going right now and maybe evolve it a little bit over time. But they're not trying to conquer the world. And so there's this concern of, if I want to stay small, will that work? Will I still have a place in 5-10 years? And certainly over 5-10 years, a lot of things are going to change, and everybody knows that, but it still creates this kind of worry and angst about whether or not what you're currently doing is going to be sustainable in the long run. And lastly, I think all this is unfolding against a background where we see the open web as being kind of an ecosystem in danger. Something that, again, going back to what we all believe in, freedom, publishing, and so forth, and we've built our careers here, it's under siege to a certain extent. I'm going to borrow some slides from Dries Bijtjaert, who's the leader of the Drupal project, who has a great talk at South by Southwest last year, and he gave me permission to bite a few slides from his thing just to open it. So the open web is the idea of an open platform with greater choice and transparency. This is like the Vint Cerf, Tim Berners-Lee internet. No, you don't have to ask permission from anyone to put up a website, and anyone can link to anybody, and it is this flourishing ecosystem. As opposed to the walled garden principle, which is, has actually a long pedigree. America Online started as a walled garden. Prodigy was a walled garden, and so forth. And the hallmarks of open web is creative freedom, serendipitous discovery, control over your experience, control over your privacy, and decentralization. The notion that there's not a central authority or not even a few central nodes that really effectively control everything. And the closed web is one where templates really control the creative license that people have. Algorithms determine what you see, and maybe without even your knowledge. Privacy is a constant question, and surveillance and tracking are pervasive. And siloed information within companies, within technologies, prevents innovation. So there's lots of work that can only happen within a silo, and that limits what's possible inherently. And this is actually, like I said before, there's a long pedigree. I think this is kind of a cyclical thing where things swing back and forth from open to closed. And you see when things swing towards open, there's a flourishing of innovation. I think around when WordPress and Drupal both started to get lots of traction in the mid to late aughts. That was a kind of a boom time for the open web. But then you saw the rise of social media and platforms and smartphone devices kind of taking a lot of the things that were being exploratorily demonstrated in the open web and refining them into like deliverable consumer experiences that didn't require you to know a lot about technology and so forth. And so things swing back towards closed, and then it gets a little stagnant, and hopefully they swing back towards open. This goes on over and over and over again. But I think we're at a point right now where it has swung quite a ways towards closed, and there's concern with the number of like big companies that control the a critical number of services online. When is that pendulum going to start to swing back, and what will that look like? And I think even more so, there's this general feeling that I have, which is troubling, that the openness of the web is actually being used to harm itself. So this is like the phenomenon of quote-unquote fake news, right? And whatever your political persuasion, like the way in disinformation is propagating right now is concerning. So like I had this experience of after the election seeing a bunch of tweets that I thought were kind of incorrect, talking about vote totals and wondering where that was coming from because people seemed to really believe it. And I traced it back and traced it back and traced it back, and it turns out it's 70news.wordpress.com. Somebody set this up, and they're just publishing their fake news and getting people all riled up about it. And like that could be someone who has an agenda. That could be someone who's just looking for ad impressions. And it's the openness of the web is kind of creates the opportunity for a few bad apples to really like have an outsized impact. To borrow this slide from another great presentation, this is the bullshit principle. The amount of energy necessary to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude larger than to produce it. And so it doesn't take that many people who don't have everybody's best interests at heart to make things hard for everyone. You see this with just like the power of trolling. And like it's really kind of unfortunate that a few hundred people can ruin people's lives, and we don't have good answers to these questions right now. And I think while that's not like WordPress's job to solve, it is a part of the ecosystem that we exist in, and the fact that this goes on makes it harder for us to do what we want to do. And I think it also makes the open web more noisy and more annoying. So the more the open web feels like it's a place that is risky and dangerous and hard to be, the more a walled garden seems appealing. The more a closed platform might seem like a trade-off worth making. And that is, definitely troubling, something to think about. So to recap, we have publishing and site building are super competitive. WordPress doesn't get enough respect upmarket. Professionalization leads to cultural friction, and the open web is under threat. These are, I think, our big problems. And so now I'll talk a little bit positively about what we could do to move forward. So first of all, competing for publishing and site building. I think the first thing to do is understand that this happens across a spectrum. So I'm going to just very crudely be like low budget on one end, high budget on the other. And if you think about how the spectrum works, you've got like totally free personal publishing, totally free personal publishing on one side, and like bespoke website building using WordPress as a CMS framework on the other. And in between, a few stages. And there are services from like Automatic that serve across this whole spectrum. WordPress plays across this entire spectrum. There are services from the community that play across this spectrum. And I'm not even getting into all the hosts and all the agencies and so forth that work across this entire spectrum. Like we work this whole area. But they're different customers for each of these things in different areas. And it's important to understand who your customer is, whether that's direct to consumer, it's a prosumer, a very small business, kind of like a sole proprietor or mom and pop, a small business that might be hiring professionals, outsourcing marketing to an agency, or a corporation or enterprise which likely has some in-house team handling some of this and is using outsiders to bring in expertise or augment that team. And I think it's key to us to recognize that at the very, very far end of the spectrum for purely personal publishing, WordPress initially had a really key role in bringing that out. But I think we all just need to recognize that social media actually gives people a lot more of what they want from purely personal publishing. They get more direct feedback from their audience. And there are a number of other services, like everything from Tumblr to LiveJournal, that do everything that we could do with WordPress. And so while I don't think that there's not a place for WordPress at that end, I think we should recognize that that is going to be served by a wide range of services, and it's not really, a place for us to compete. When it comes to the SaaS thing, Right, this is really where, and I'll say it again, this is where, in my opinion, WordPress.com is uniquely capable of competing here because it's big, it's backed by a lot of expertise. If they wanted to, they could have a Super Bowl commercial. I'm not saying they need to, but if they wanted to, they could compete at that level from a marketing standpoint. And they're just like a big company that can compete at that level. Really, like, they're uniquely situated to compete with Squarespace and Wix. Like, individual, small, one-off projects aren't going to do that, although they can be contributing. I think if people really are passionate about this, we need to think about how we join together. Like, a lot of the work that we're doing in WordPress core, like to improve the user experience around site building and content management, is directly focused on winning this competition or being more competitive at this level. So I think for those of us who are passionate about this, getting more involved in those types of projects, finding a place to join up is really the best way forward as a developer. If you want to do your own thing, you can march to the beat of your own drum. You don't have to go become a core developer, which isn't for everybody. But again, think about like that consumer or prosumer audience, and think about how to make it so that you don't have to be a developer to use your thing. Think about how you could set something up as a service, if possible. There's a lot more work that goes into that, but there's a lot more value that you can create if you do. And recognize that at this level, if WordPress is more competitive at this level, kind of at the base level of where people are using WordPress in the context of a real business project, the more competitive WordPress is there, the better everybody else will be. It is a rising tide that should lift all boats. The better the user experience for WordPress, the better everybody's projects will be. The more WordPress is a household name and people have experience with it because they used it somewhere else, the better all the other projects will be. So this is kind of like, to me, the base layer of what we can do to be competitive and continue to grow the project over time. Winning enterprise adoption is a long-term proposition, but I think it is already happening and will continue to happen. So apologies for the slightly NSFW slide, but this is a real billboard that is up in San Francisco. Like, this is on the highway. And it's like, Silicon Valley is incredibly competitive in this way, but I think it's actually worldwide. Like, there is a huge shortage of talent. It's massive. And that is, I think, for us as developers, like, we're not going to go out and pitch Gartner and convince them to put WordPress in the top right of the Magic Quadrant. But we can go out and make more great developers. Like, we can duplicate ourselves and multiply ourselves, and we can get at this concern that drives people away from WordPress at the high level, where they're looking at what's called total cost. Like, not the cost to get a project launched, but the cost to like maintain that project over 4 to 5 years. And they think, there's this big invisible cost with WordPress. It's all this risk. I don't know if we can do this, and so they don't. So they'd rather write a big check and have a sure thing than take a risk with WordPress. And I think if we make more qualified WordPress developers in the world, and we do a better job of like putting our best practices out there, we can start to shift this equation. It's already happening, but I think if we thought about it as a real project, it could happen faster. It gets back to this notion of the iron price, right? We on the consumer end, like with WordPress.com and competing with SaaS, it's about basically getting rid of the iron price and making it a gold proposition. This is about like just putting a lot more iron in the universe, right? Making it so that people can buy their way to success with WordPress in the same way that they can with Adobe or Sitecore or the like. The way, this is something we can all do, like aspire to be professional grade and promote and sell that vision. Like, you can go out and start to do this type of work. There's a little bit, again, in the imposter syndrome area that leads people to feel nervous about this, which I understand. I'll take another page from my actor friends from back in the day. Every day I move to LA, they all tell you, fake it till you make it. And there's an aspect of that in business too. If you don't put yourself out there as saying, I can do this, I am an expert, nobody's going to actually hire you to do those kinds of projects as an expert. So sell your vision, like aspire to be professional grade. I think it's something we can all do. You can also just like multiply yourself. Like I said, we can clone ourselves by consulting, inspiring, coaching, and doing documentation. There's like a million things out there for WordPress for Dummies, but we don't have that many things out there that are WordPress for professionals. And I think if we worked together, we'd discover, that's what conferences like this are great for. And that's what hallway tracks are great for. And we just need more of that and for it to happen and to bubble up and to reach a point where we actually get to best practices in this community. Because like I overhear things from lots of different shops. Like that's one of the joys of being at Pantheon, is I get to like kind of drop in on lots of different little agencies and little projects and see what's going on. And like there is a lot of reinventing the wheel that still happens. Even though they're all using the same core CMS framework, there's this, yeah, you know, we have our same stack of plugins and themes that we often use, and we've got some stuff that's in-house that we want to open source someday, but we haven't gotten there yet because like we keep like tinkering with it for every different client project. Like, who's got something like that going on in their life right now, right? Like, many of us. And if we just got together and said, okay, there's nothing strategic in us having that being internal and unique, we could put these things together and really advance best practices in terms of how you build big, complex, meaningful websites with WordPress, I think we would move forward more quickly. Again, this is happening organically, but if we thought about it as a thing, I think it would happen a little bit faster. And it is happening. So here's a great story that I picked up at WordCamp US. So this is Tom Wilmot from Human Made, or as I like to call him, the Harry Potter of WordPress. I couldn't find a picture of him with a scarf, but it's uncanny. So he was talking about how client project can't divulge too many details, but they're working with a big design creative agency, so like some big ad agency, and a major financial institution in the UK. And what's great about that project, and delivering WordPress for a lot of sites, what's great about that project is they're not in there like knocking out the sites. They're doing code reviews and training other people. So they're being brought in as the experts, and then there's a creative team that's as the design and user experience experts, and then they're actually working together to create something and actually build expertise within the client company so that they can adopt WordPress and feel really good about it. So these sorts of things are happening out there in the wild in our market, and I think more of it can happen if we focus on making it happen. And I've seen this before in my career with Drupal. Like there was a process that definitely occurred over 2006 to 2012 and continued even beyond that, where a lot of people who had been open source contributors or independent contractors, they just sort of leveled up. And they started doing bigger projects and saying, we can handle this kind of stuff, and we're ready for it. And it works. If people do it, it really works. And it's not necessarily something for everyone. You don't have to do this, but it is totally possible. And in the end, I think as we go through this transition, we'll end up with a much more diverse, independent, and thriving economy around WordPress, which is going to be a good thing for everybody in this space. So being pro and keeping your soul, this is an important thing as we contemplate this transition. So number one, nobody's going to make you wear pants. At a pro level, you can still work remotely, and you just keep the camera up here, and nobody needs to know. But the point is that this doesn't I don't believe that this fundamentally threatens the culture. I think that it's something that people feel nervous about, and we can become professionals in our own way. And I also think we can do a lot of good for ourselves by building bridges with the existing communities of practice and existing professionals. Like, we're an open and inclusive community. That should include being open and inclusive to people who wear pleated khakis and have clip-on cell phones. Like, we should have more of those folks in our world as well. We can bring some existing professionals in, which is a great thing. I think professionalism is also not just about like making more money and working on bigger projects. It's about taking pride in your work. And I think this is the best answer I have to overcoming imposter syndrome is just take a step back and take pride in the work that you do and give other people props for the work that they do. Because even if you taught yourself everything you know, you should be able to recognize that objectively the work that you do is awesome. And that should fill you with a good feeling. And that feeling is that of being a professional. So I think having professionalism be about pride and not about style or like measuring up to a certain bar is super important. And it just comes down to it. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And you can stay weird if you want while you're a professional. This does not have to change you if you don't want it to. And so it's basically the message is don't be afraid. If you want to do it, just jump in. So finally, defending the open web. And this is a big one for me because it's kind of existential. I think the internet is a net positive thing for humanity. Who agrees? Okay, great. We're all here. I feel that with an asterisk or more provisos than I did 2, 4, 5 years ago. I was more optimistic and more like unqualifiedly optimistic about this earlier. You were starting to see some of the, to give props for another great presentation, the dark side of democratization. It definitely, it's out there. It's not unqualified good. And as someone who makes the internet, that strikes a very personal chord with me. And I think that the pendulum swing can also kind of be a wrecking ball, right? We recognize that change often means leaving things behind. Change often means, something being torn down in order to create something new. And that creates a sense of angst. But kind of like, just to be a little bit Buddhist about it, you just got to get over that. Like, that's part of life. To embrace it. I think as developers, one of the things that we can focus on in this world is to protect the pipes, to protect the infrastructure. So not only in a defensive way, because I think we're about to find out what telecom companies will do when net neutrality is no longer a law, which is going to be interesting, but also to actually try to enhance the value of open platforms. The more things we build that have open APIs, the more things that we create that can be used to mash things up and draw together different data and different services, that's going to intrinsically increase the value of open platforms. And I think as developers, we can make a meaningful contribution here at the infrastructure or the data integration level. And I think that that's important because in science fiction, every time there's like a bubble world or like a generation ship or like you try to create a closed ecosystem, it always goes wrong, right? It always turns like creepy and weird at a certain point. And I don't want the internet to like just be a bunch of creepy, weird bubbles. And I also think that centralized authority is inherently risky. Even if we see a centralized authority that is behaving in a benevolent manner, it's like no guarantee that that benevolence will continue. So decentralization is an incredibly important principle. And I think, the development of an independent economy and independent services and more independent platforms is really, really key to the future benefit. And we can be a part of that. We can do some of that ourselves. We can join up with efforts that are seeking to empower those that do it. I also think we can look in the mirror a little bit and recognize that a lot of the biggest problems, the social problems that we see with terrible behavior on the internet are not technology problems. They're enabled by technology, but they're human problems, and they have human solutions. I think we have to recognize that we can't just wait for the mods or the admins to come and save us, right? You can't, it's not going to work on the internet to call the cops on someone. Doesn't mean you shouldn't report abuse, and it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be laws about behavior, but I don't think we can wait for an external savior to come sweep away the badness that we all see. I think we have to take a stand against it ourselves, first and foremost as human beings, and then as technology professionals. I think that there's already some of the stuff in the ecosystem. So I was talking to JJJ a little bit, and he's like, a lot of what you're talking about was like the original vision for BuddyPress, like sites that can connect to sites and aggregators of aggregators and ways to integrate activity and create a more of a diaspora of publishing and so forth. And there was this project called Diaspora, which was explicitly trying to build the decentralized Facebook. Didn't really succeed because it's a very difficult problem. It's hard from a technology standpoint and from user experience standpoint. But there's history with us in there, and we can take this up again. I asked myself, like, what is the next RSS? Like, this was a really simple syndication, was a very easy to use and fundamental technology that enabled a whole lot to flourish. And then eventually it kind of got siloed up again. But we're going to break out of those silos eventually. And what are the next set of technologies that allow us to do that? And with WordPress being so pervasive on the internet, WordPress's ability to embrace that next set of technologies is incredibly powerful. And I think that is something we're going to see as the pendulum still begins to swing, right? We see like visionary people, Silicon Valley types, like this guy, Peter Levine from Andreessen Horowitz, is a big VC firm. He's smart, right? So he's talking about how we are already seeing like the end of the cloud computing era. Like mobile cloud is kind of our current moment, and it's kind of still gathering a lot of steam. But in the future, like your car is going to be a supercomputer too. So the ability to harness all the intelligence that's at the edge of the networks will define who wins in the future. And what are the ways in which we can actually integrate and aggregate across those things? So I think the future is really ours to write. We are the people who make the internet, and it's up to us to make it the best place that it can possibly be. And that is what I will leave you with. And thank you again for all your attention, and have a wonderful LoopConf.